The Rusty Nail Tavern reeked of stale ale and broken dreams. Tinus Yara slumped over the bar, his once striking features now hidden beneath a matted beard and bloodshot eyes. He raised a trembling hand, signaling the barkeep for another drink. "You've had enough," Tinus the barkeep grunted, wiping a grimy mug. "Time to crawl back to your hole." Tinus let out a bitter laugh. "My coin's good as anyone's, Darnick. One more." As Darnick reluctantly poured, a commotion erupted from the back of the tavern. A booming voice cut through the din. "Who dares challenge the luck of Brom the Bold? Step up, if you've got the stones." Tinus's ears perked up. He'd heard whispers of Brom's legendary poker games and the fortunes won and lost at his table. With liquid courage coursing through his veins, Tinus staggered towards the game. "I'll take that challenge," he slurred, fishing out his last few coins. Brom, a mountain of a man with a face like weathered leather, eyed Tinus with amusement. "Well, well, if it isn't the town drunk. Pull up a chair, boys. This'll be quick." Hours blurred by in a haze of cards, curses, and increasingly desperate bets. Tinus's meager pile of coins dwindled, then grew, then dwindled again. Just as he was about to admit defeat, Brom pushed all his winnings to the center of the table. "One last hand," Brom growled. "All or nothing." Tinus looked at his cards, then at the mountain of coins. He had nothing left to wager except his life. "Deal me in," Tinus whispered. The tavern fell silent as the final cards were revealed. Tinus's hands shook as he laid down his hand a royal flush. Brom's face turned ashen. "Impossible," he sputtered. As Tinus reached for his winnings, Brom's meaty hand clamped down on his wrist. "Wait," Brom said, his voice low and dangerous. "I've got something better than coin." From beneath his cloak, Brom produced an ornate wooden chest, its surface etched with strange symbols. "This has been in my family for generations," he said. "Worth 10 times what's on the table. It's yours, if you walk away now." Tinus hesitated, his gaze darting between the chest and the pile of coins. Something in Brom's eyes, desperation, fear, made the decision for him. "Deal," Tinus said, snatching the chest. As he stumbled out of the Rusty Nail, clutching his prize, Tinus could have sworn he heard Brom mutter, "Your funeral, fool." But Tinus paid no mind. For the first time in years, luck was on his side, and tomorrow he'd be rich. Tinus stumbled through the muddy streets, the mysterious chest tucked under his arm. The cool night air did little to clear his ale-addled mind as he made his way to the dilapidated shack he called home. His hovel, as the townsfolk mockingly referred to it, was a sorry sight. A ramshackle structure on the outskirts of town, it leaned precariously to one side, its roof more holes than thatch. But tonight, Tinus saw it through different eyes. Tonight, it would become a palace. Fumbling with the rusty lock, Tinus burst inside, nearly tripping over the meager furnishings. He placed the chest reverently on his rickety table, running his hands over its intricate carvings. "All right, you beauty," he muttered. "Let's see what treasures you're hiding." With trembling fingers, Tinus worked at the chest's clasp. It resisted at first, decades of neglect having sealed it shut. But Tinus was a man possessed. He grabbed a nearby poker, jamming it into the seam and throwing his weight against it. With a loud crack, the lid flew open. Tinus's eyes widened, his breath catching in his throat as he peered inside. But instead of the glittering jewels or ancient artifacts he'd imagined, he found junk. The chest was filled with an assortment of seemingly worthless odds and ends. A tarnished spoon, a handful of smooth river stones, a frayed length of rope, a cracked marble, and buried beneath it all, what looked like a piece of old parchment, so faded it was nearly invisible. "No," Tinus whispered, his voice rising to a roar. "No, no, no." In a frenzy, he upended the chest, scattering its contents across the floor. He dropped to his knees, sifting through the debris, praying to find anything of value. But there was nothing, just useless trinkets and broken dreams. Rage and despair washed over Tinus in equal measure. He'd been so close to changing his miserable life. And now? With a wordless cry of anguish, Tinus swiped the chest off the table. It hit the wall with a dull thud, one final insult to his hopes. Spent and defeated, Tinnis collapsed onto his threadbare cot. As consciousness slipped away, one bitter thought echoed in his mind. Some luck never changes. The first rays of dawn crept through the numerous holes in Tinnis's roof, painting the room in a soft, golden light. One persistent beam found its way to Tinnis's face, rousing him from his alcohol-induced slumber. He groaned, his head pounding with the mother of all hangovers. As Tinnis slowly regained consciousness, the events of the previous night came flooding back. The poker game, the chest, the disappointing contents. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing it all to be a bad dream. But when he opened them again, the scattered items across his floor confirmed his bitter reality. Tinnis let out a heavy sigh and began to push himself up, ready to face another day of crushing disappointment. That's when he saw it. The sunbeam that had awakened him was now illuminating something on the floor, something he'd overlooked in his drunken rage the night before. Among the worthless trinkets lay a piece of parchment, previously unnoticed due to its faded appearance. But now, as if by magic, the sunlight revealed intricate lines and markings that seemed to shimmer and dance across its surface. Intrigued, Tinnis scrambled over, his hangover momentarily forgotten. With trembling hands, he carefully lifted the parchment, holding it up to the light. His breath caught in his throat. It was a map. Not just any map, but one unlike anything he'd ever seen. It depicted lands both familiar and strange, with cryptic symbols and annotations in a language he didn't recognize. But one thing was clear: it led to something important. As Tinnis studied the map, his eyes were drawn to a particular location, marked with an ominous symbol, a stylized dragon coiled around what appeared to be a mountain. Excitement coursed through Tinnis's veins, instantly clearing the fog of alcohol from his mind. This was it. This was his chance, perhaps his last chance at a life of adventure and riches beyond his wildest dreams. Without a second thought, Tinnis leapt into action. He grabbed his tattered pack, stuffing it with what meager supplies he could find. The useless trinkets from the chest were hastily shoved in as well. Who knew what secrets they might hold? As he prepared to leave his hovel behind, Tinnis paused at the threshold. He looked back at the life he was leaving, the squalor, the despair, the endless cycle of drink and regret. Then he looked down at the map in his hands, his ticket to a new beginning. With a determined grin, Tinnis stepped out into the morning sun. Adventure awaited, and for the first time in years he felt truly alive. Tinnis set out from his hometown with a spring in his step and hope in his heart. The mysterious map clutched tightly in his hand, he followed its cryptic directions, venturing into lands he'd only heard of in tavern tales. As days turned to weeks, the initial excitement of his quest began to wane. The map's riddles proved more challenging than he'd anticipated, and the harsh realities of the road took their toll. Tinnis found himself longing for the numbing comfort of ale, but he pressed on, driven by the promise of untold riches. It was on a particularly grueling day, as Tinnis struggled through a dense forest, that fate intervened. A whoosh and a thud stopped him in his tracks. An arrow quivered in the tree trunk beside his head. That was a warning shot, came a voice from the shadows. The next one won't miss. Tinnis raised his hands slowly. I mean no harm, he called out. I'm just a traveler, looking for a bit of adventure. A lithe figure emerged from behind a tree, bow still drawn. It was a woman with fierce eyes and hair as wild as the forest around them. Adventure, you say, she scoffed. Looks more like you're running from something. Before Tinnis could respond, a booming laugh echoed through the clearing. Ha! If he's running, he's doing a piss-poor job of it. A stocky dwarf lumbered into view, his beard braided and adorned with small trinkets. Name's Crom, he grunted, eyeing Tinnis suspiciously. What brings a scrawny human like you to these parts? Tinnis hesitated, then decided honesty was his best bet. He produced the map, explaining his quest. To his surprise, both the archer and the dwarf leaned in with interest. I'm Zara, the woman said, finally lowering her bow, and I know these lands better than anyone. That map of yours, it's leading somewhere dangerous. Crom nodded. Dragon territory, if I'm not mistaken. You're either very brave or very stupid human. Tinnis gulped. Probably a bit of both, he admitted. But I've come too far to turn back now. A moment of silence passed between the three. Then, unexpectedly, Zara cracked a smile. "Well, I've been itching for a real challenge. Count me in." "What?" Crom sputtered. "You can't be serious. We don't even know this fool." "Oh, come on, you old grump," Zara teased. "Where's your sense of adventure?" As the dwarf grumbled, a timid voice piped up from behind a nearby bush. Could I come too?" A young woman with bright eyes and robes covered in arcane symbols stepped into the clearing. "I'm Lyria," she said, fidgeting nervously. I'm a mage." "Well, sort of. I'm still learning, but I want to help." Tinnis looked at the unlikely group forming around him. A skilled archer with trust issues, a gruff dwarf seeking purpose, a novice mage eager to prove herself, and him a former drunk chasing an impossible dream. He couldn't help but laugh. "Well," he said, grinning at his new companions, "I suppose misery loves company. Welcome aboard, friends." After weeks of treacherous travel, the mismatched party finally stood before the looming mountain depicted on Tinnis's map. Its peak disappeared into ominous storm clouds, and an eerie silence blanketed the area. "Well, we're here," Tinnis said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now what?" Zara squinted at the mountainside. There she pointed. A cave entrance, half hidden behind those boulders. Crom hefted his battle axe. "Aye, that'll be our way in. Let's hope the dragon's out for a fly, eh?" As they approached the cave, Lyria's hands began to glow with a soft blue light. "I can sense powerful magic ahead," she murmured. "We should be careful." The group entered the mountain, navigating through winding tunnels that seemed to go on forever. The air grew thick with the stench of brimstone, and an oppressive heat built with each step. Finally, they emerged into a vast cavern. Mountains of gold coins, jewels, and priceless artifacts stretched as far as the eye could see. And there, curled atop the largest pile, lay their quarry. The dragon was enormous, its scales a deep crimson that seemed to absorb the light. But as they watched, something seemed off. "Is it?" Snoring, Tinnis asked incredulously. Indeed, the great beast's chest rose and fell with deep, rumbling breaths. As they crept closer, they could see that its scales were dulled with age, and patches of them had fallen away entirely. Suddenly, the dragon's eyes snapped open. It raised its head, regarding the intruders with a mixture of annoyance and weariness. "Who dares disturb my slumber?" it growled, its voice like grinding boulders. The party froze, weapons at the ready. But instead of attacking, the dragon merely sighed, releasing a puff of smoke. "Let me guess," it continued, "you've come for my treasure, to slay the mighty beast and claim glory." Tinnis stepped forward, his heart pounding. "Well, yes, actually." The dragon let out a sound that might have been a chuckle. How disappointingly predictable. "Very well, let's get this over with." What followed was a battle unlike any they had imagined. The dragon was formidable, yes, but it was clear that age had taken its toll. Its fire breath was more smoke than flame, and its movements were slow and labored. The team worked in perfect sync, Zara's arrows finding weak spots in the dragon's armor, Crom's axe chipping away at its defenses, Lyria's magic deflecting its attacks, and Tinnis darting in to land crucial blows. After what seemed like hours, the dragon finally collapsed, its breaths coming in ragged gasps. "Well fought," it wheezed. "It seems. My time has come at last." As the light faded from the dragon's eyes, the group stood in stunned silence. They had done it. They had actually slain a dragon. Tinnis looked around at his companions, battered, exhausted, but alive. Then his gaze fell on the sea of treasure surrounding them. "We did it," he breathed. "We're rich beyond our wildest dreams." As the reality of their victory sank in, the cavern filled with joyous laughter and celebration. They had faced the impossible and emerged victorious. The journey back from the dragon's lair was considerably lighter, both in spirit and in load. Each member of the party carried as much treasure as they could manage, with promises to return for more once they had secured safe transport. As they approached the outskirts of Tinnis's hometown, word of their feat had somehow preceded them. A crowd had gathered, cheering and waving as the unlikely heroes made their way through the streets. "It's Tinnis Yara," someone shouted. the Dragon Slayer. Tinnis couldn't help but grin. It was a far cry from the jeers and pitying looks he'd grown accustomed to. He glanced at his companions, seeing his own disbelief and joy mirrored in their faces. The group was ushered into the Rusty Nail Tavern, the very place where Tinnis's adventure had begun. Dornick, the surly barkeep, now beamed with pride. "Drinks are on the house for the heroes," he announced to raucous applause. As flagons of ale were passed around, Tinnis stood on a table, raising his drink high. To new beginnings he toasted, and to the best damn team a washed-up drunk could ask for. The celebration that followed was one for the ages. Tales of their adventure grew taller with each retelling, the dragon becoming more fearsome and their victory more impressive with every pass. Zara, usually guarded, laughed freely as she demonstrated her archery skills to an awestruck crowd. Crom engaged in a drinking contest with a group of locals, his booming laughter echoing through the tavern. Lyria, emboldened by their success, and perhaps a bit too much wine, entertained onlookers with small magical displays. As for Tinnis, he revelled in the attention, buying rounds for everyone and promising grand plans for the town's future. The night wore on, a blur of toasts, songs, and increasingly outlandish vows of friendship. It was well past midnight when Tinnis stumbled out of the tavern for a breath of fresh air, his head spinning pleasantly. He looked up at the stars, marveling at how much his life had changed in such a short time. Who would have thought, he mused aloud, that a game of cards would lead to all this? With a contented sigh, Tinnis made his way back to his old hovel. He had grander accommodations lined up, of course, but for tonight it felt right to come full circle. As he collapsed onto his rickety cot, still fully clothed, Tinnis's last thoughts before drifting off were of the bright future ahead. No more scrounging for drinks or living hand to mouth. Tomorrow would mark the start of a new life, one of comfort and respect. If only he knew how fleeting that dream would prove to be. The morning sun crept through the hole in Tinnis's roof, just as it had countless times before. But this time, instead of gently rousing him, it felt like a hammer striking his skull. Tinnis groaned, his mouth dry as sandpaper and his head throbbing with the mother of all hangovers. Slowly, the events of the previous night came filtering back through the haze of alcohol. The triumphant return, the raucous celebration, the endless toasts. Tinnis sat up with a jolt, instantly regretting the sudden movement. Where was the treasure? In his drunken state, he'd brought a sizable portion back to his hovel, intending to secure better lodgings in the morning. He looked around frantically, his heart sinking as he took in the scene. The rickety table was overturned, his meagre possessions strewn about, and the chest that had contained their hard-won riches nowhere to be seen. No, Tinnis muttered, scrambling to his feet. He tore through the small shack, searching every corner, praying it was just misplaced in his drunken stupor. But the truth was undeniable. They'd been robbed. Panic rising in his throat, Tinnis burst out of his hovel and raced towards the inn where his companions had stayed. He found them in various states of distress, all coming to the same horrifying realization. "It's all gone," Zara said, her voice hollow. "Every last coin." Crom punched a wall in frustration, leaving a sizable dent. "We let our guard down," he growled. "Celebrated too hard, too soon." Lyria sat in a corner, tears streaming down her face. "I should have put up wards," she whispered. "Some mage I turned out to be." As the gravity of their situation sank in, a heavy silence fell over the group. Everything they'd fought for, all the dangers they'd faced, it had all been for nothing. They were right back where they started, perhaps even worse off than before. Tinnis slumped against a wall, sliding down to sit on the floor. He stared at his hands, feeling the familiar pull of despair that he'd thought he'd left behind. It would be so easy to find the nearest tavern, to drown his sorrows and forget. That's when he noticed it. A strange mark on his forearm, like a tattoo he didn't remember getting. It looked almost like a stylized dragon, coiled around a mountain peak. As he stared at it, confused, the mark began to glow with a faint, pulsing light. And then, impossibly, Tinnis heard a voice. It wasn't audible, not really, more like a whisper directly in his mind. "The journey is not over, Tinnis Yara," it said. "It has only just begun." Tinnis's head snapped up, looking at his companions. From their wide-eyed expressions, he knew they'd heard it too. "Did you?" Lyria began, her voice trembling. Before anyone could respond, the mysterious voice continued. "Find the Crimson Citadel. There, your true destiny awaits." As suddenly as it had appeared, the glow faded, leaving behind only the strange mark and 1,000 unanswered questions. Tinnis looked at his friends, seeing a mixture of fear and intrigue on their faces. Despite everything they'd been through, despite the crushing loss they'd just suffered, he felt a familiar spark of excitement igniting in his chest. "Well," he said, a wry smile tugging at his lips, "who's up for another adventure?" And so, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, 4 unlikely heroes set out once more, broke, hungover, and utterly unprepared for the challenges that lay ahead. But this time, they were driven not by dreams of riches, but by a mystery that promised to be greater than anything they'd faced before. The tale of Tinnis Yara and his companions was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. Thank you so very much for listening to this story. I thoroughly hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, please subscribe, leave a like, and comment too. I hope to see you on the next adventure.